The small town of Riverway always seemed to move at half the speed of the rest of the world. The streets were lined with tall oak trees, their branches still wet from the morning's mist. Soft golden light filtered through the leaves, casting sleepy patterns on cobblestone sidewalks. It was the kind of town where you could hear the wind brush past your coat, where people smiled without needing to say much. Claire Whitmore never liked noise. As a children's book illustrator, she found comfort in silence hours lost in colors, brushstrokes, and quiet thoughts. Her small studio was tucked above a bookstore owned by her best friend's grandmother, with ivy curling around the windows, and the smell of old paper drifting up through the floorboards. She lived quietly, worked quietly, and healed quietly from things no one else really knew about. She wasn't looking for love, especially not after the last time that this morning, like most, she wandered into Maple and Pine Cafe, sketchbook under her arm, scarf half-wrapped, and glasses slightly crooked from the way she always pushed them up with the back of her hand while drawing. The cafe hummed softly with the sound of spoons and mugs, a guitar instrumental playing faintly through the speakers. She stood in line, flipping open her sketchbook to a half-finished drawing of a fox and a bear dancing in a forest. The fox's eyes weren't quite right, and she chewed the end of her pencil, trying to fix it in her mind before committing to ink. That's when she felt someone watching her. She looked up and met the gaze of a man seated by the window, a steaming mug between his hands and a small leather notebook open in front of him. He was tall, with tousled brown hair and kind, deep-set eyes that looked like they'd seen a lifetime of quiet things. He wasn't smiling, but his gaze was warm, curious. Not in a way that made her nervous, but in a way that made her feel. Noticed that Claire blinked, then glanced away. She ordered her chai, cheeks warm, and made her way to the only empty table across from him. The chair creaked softly as she sat. Her hands hovered above the page. She told herself not to look again, not to wonder, not to feel that strange flutter in her chest, but then a voice. Low, gentle, slightly rough, like wind over stone. "Is that yours?" She looked up. He was nodding toward her sketchbook. "Yes," she said, voice nearly a whisper. "It's beautiful," he said. The way the fox is looking at the bear, like he's waiting for the music to start. Claire blinked. No one ever noticed those kinds of details. She opened her mouth to reply, but found herself smiling instead. "I'm sorry, was that too?" "Forward?" he added quickly. "I'm terrible at small talk." "Or any talk, really?" She shook her head. "No, it was actually kind of perfect." He offered a hand. "Elliot." She hesitated just a second, then reached out. "Claire." Their hands met in a quiet, slow handshake. No sparks, no thunder, just warmth, real warmth. The kind that seeps into your bones when you didn't know you were cold. "Do you come here often?" he asked, then winced. That sounded less like a pickup line in my head. Claire laughed, soft and genuine. "It's okay, and yes, I work upstairs." "Ah, that explains the sketchbook," Elliot said, eyes dropping back to the page. "Children's books?" She nodded. "You?" "I'm a carpenter," he said, and his fingers lightly tapped the edge of his coffee mug. "Mostly furniture. Sometimes doors. Lately, nothing." There was something in his tone and ache she recognized. They sat quietly for a moment, letting the soft murmur of the cafe fill the silence between them. Then Elliot spoke again. "I like the way you draw. Expressions. There's a lot of emotion in those faces." Claire's smile dimmed a little, just around the edges. "Sometimes it's easier to draw how you feel than to say it." He nodded, understanding flickering across his face like sunlight through clouds. "Yeah, sometimes silence says more anyway." They didn't say much more after that. Claire sipped her chai, sketched a little. Elliot scribbled a few lines in his notebook, the corners of his mouth twitching as if the words were cooperating for once. Occasionally, their eyes met. Occasionally, they smiled, and when she finally stood to leave, brushing a curl from her cheek and slipping her sketchbook under her arm, he said something so soft she almost missed it. "I hope your fox finds his music." She paused, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, she replied, "Maybe he already did." Outside, the sky had turned the color of linen. The breeze tugged at her scarf, and Claire walked slowly down Main Street, heart thudding in that quiet, unfamiliar way that signaled something was beginning. Something soft, something honest, not something worth listening to. Claire Whitmore believed in magic, the quiet kind that lived between pages and whispered through colors. As a child, she had spent long hours nestled in a corner of her parents' tiny bookstore, sketching fairies in the margins of homework and dreaming of worlds that didn't talk back. Her parents, gentle souls with ink-stained fingers, had loved her softly and deeply until a rainy night when a single wrong turn on an unfamiliar highway took them away forever. She was 19. Her world collapsed in on itself. The bookstore was sold. College was paused. Claire drifted for a while, her sketchbooks the only constant. Eventually, she came back to Riverway, a town that had wrapped its arms around her grief without asking questions. Her best friend's grandmother, Miriam, offered her the attic studio above her newly opened bookstore. Claire accepted, unpacking her memories into soft-walled corners filled with fairy lights and watercolor dreams. Now 27, Claire had built a quiet routine. She illustrated books for small publishers, took commissions for custom art, and spent her weekends volunteering at the town library's storytime hour. Her days were soft, simple, and lonely in the kind of way that didn't ache so much as echo. She told herself she didn't mind. After all, she had tried once with someone who didn't understand that. Grief doesn't move in straight lines or on someone else's schedule. That breakup had been quiet too, just like everything in her life, except maybe the way she'd felt when Elliot looked at her drawing like it meant something. Elliot Hayes was 31 and had lived most of his life building things with his hands because he found it harder to build things with his words. He had been born in Riverway, in a weather-beaten house with green shutters and a mother who could fix anything with duct tape and strong coffee. His father had been gone before Elliot could remember just a name that didn't stick. A ghost no one missed. His mom had done her best. She worked 3 jobs and still managed to attend every school play, every art show where Elliot submitted crooked birdhouses instead of paintings. She died 4 winters ago, quietly, with her hands wrapped around one of his hand-carved spoons and a smile on her face. He hadn't built anything since. He tried. Opened the workshop every morning, measured, planned, sawed. But nothing stayed. He'd start a chair and abandon it. Carve half a tabletop before sanding it into dust. The joy had left with her. People in town knew him. Kind, quiet, always willing to help fix a squeaky step or reinforce an old bench on Main Street. But no one really asked how he was doing. Maybe because they knew he wouldn't say "Dad" until yesterday. Until her. He hadn't meant to notice Claire Whitmore, but she walked into the cafe with a kind of presence that didn't shout. It simply settled in, like a story waiting to unfold. There was something in the way she held her sketchbook close to her heart, like it was part of her. Something in her eyes, something familiar. He had no reason to speak to her. But he did. And when she smiled, really smiled, it felt like the first full breath he'd taken in months. Riverway was more than a town. It was a haven. The streets curved like a sleepy river, and every shop had a story. Mrs. Hamway's flower stand bloomed, brighter than anywhere else in the county. Kids raced bikes past the bakery, where Mr. Flores always offered a warm roll for free on rainy days. And at night, porch lights glowed like stars fallen to earth, and you could hear crickets and wind. Chimes, if you listened closely. In this town, time didn't rush. Pain could be held gently, and love, when it came, didn't have to arrive loudly to matter. Claire loved it because it didn't ask her to be more than she was. Elliot loved it because it didn't question why he built fences for strangers when he couldn't finish a chair for himself. On Tuesday mornings, Claire walked to the bookstore cafe, always with her favorite mug in hand, a pale blue one with chipped edges and painted daisies. She always ordered the same thing. She always sat in the corner by the window. She always drew. On Tuesday mornings, Elliot sat 2 tables down. He brought his notebook, a journal filled with half-finished poems and sketches of furniture designs he no longer believed in. He'd nurse a black coffee and watch the world in silence. They had done this for 3 weeks now. It wasn't planned. They never said they'd meet, but somehow every Tuesday they were there. Sometimes they exchanged a nod, sometimes a soft hello, nevermore, until one day Claire left behind her sketchbook. She was already 2 blocks away, wrapped in thought, when Elliot noticed it lying under the chair. He picked it up, hesitated, then opened the cover. He didn't mean to flip through it. The page after page pulled him in. Woodland creatures with eyes full of emotion. Children curled under trees reading books. A girl with glasses and messy curls drawn in soft pastels, always holding the hand of something magical. At the very end, a pencil sketch not yet colored. A man sitting alone at a cafe table, notebook in front of him, coffee cooling beside his hand, and the caption written in soft cursive, "He loved me in the quietest ways." Elliot stared, and his breath caught. It began with a returned sketchbook and the kind of smile that said more than words ever could. Claire had rushed back to Maple and Pine the moment she realized her sketchbook was missing, her heart pounding, her mind racing through pages she hoped no one had seen. But Elliot was already there, standing on the sidewalk, her sketchbook in hand like it was something sacred. He didn't say much when he handed it back, just, "I didn't look through it. Just wanted to make sure it got back to you." But the way his eyes held hers, a little longer than politeness allowed, made her suspect he had. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't mind. From then on, things began to shift slowly, gently, like the sun rising behind a hill. On Tuesdays, they no longer sat 2 tables apart. They shared the window seat. Claire would bring extra muffins, and Elliot would bring a thermos of cinnamon chai he had learned to make because he remembered she liked it that way. Conversations started filling the quiet, not long ones, just enough. Enough to learn that Claire hated thunderstorms because they reminded her of the night her parents died. Enough to learn that Elliot used to love building cribs for the new babies in town until the last one he made never got picked up. They started walking together. After the cafe closed, ambling down Riverway's quiet streets where street lamps glowed like candles and the world felt softer somehow, Claire would carry her sketchbook under her arm, and Elliot would talk about his mother's garden, how it used to overflow with tulips, and how he hadn't been able to bring himself to plant anything since she passed. One night, Claire surprised him by pulling a tiny paper flower from her coat pocket. "I don't know much about gardening," she said, "but maybe this can be a start." He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He tucked the flower into his coat pocket, and it stayed there. The attraction between them built not with fireworks, but with warmth, the kind that melted frost slowly. Elliot found himself smiling more. Claire started drawing again with color, not just pencil. They didn't call it anything. They didn't define it. But Claire started arriving earlier, just to catch him walking in. And Elliot, who had always taken the long road home, now detoured just to pass the bookstore and look up at the window, hoping to see her lights still on. Their first almost date wasn't planned. It was a Saturday, and Claire had dropped a box of books in front of the store. Elliot was walking by, caught the fall, and offered to help. She made tea to thank him. They ended up sitting on the floor, surrounded by open books and fading sunlight, talking for hours. They didn't notice how the afternoon turned to evening or how their shoulders leaned closer with each story shared. They didn't kiss, but Claire's fingers brushed his when she handed him a cup, and Elliot didn't pull away. Instead, he held the cup just a little longer, like it carried more than warmth thought. The tension wasn't urgent, but it was undeniable. It showed up in the way Claire's breath caught when Elliot looked at her for too long, in the way Elliot's voice softened when he said her name, in the way they both paused before parting, as if reluctant to let the moment go. One evening, rain drizzled lightly as they walked side by side, sharing Claire's umbrella that was too small for two. Her coat was damp, her hair curling against her cheeks. Elliot glanced at her, then offered the hood of his jacket. She laughed, refused it, then offered him a space closer under her umbrella. Their shoulders touched. She didn't move. Neither did he. I used to think love had to be loud, Claire said softly, eyes fixed on the wet cobblestones. That it had to sweep you away like a storm. And now? Elliot asked. She looked up at him, the rain beating on his lashes. Now, I think maybe love can be quiet. Maybe it shows up in the pauses, in the spaces people leave open for you. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he reached out slowly, brushed a strand of damp hair behind her ear, and looked at her like she was the only story worth telling. They didn't kiss, but something passed between them then. A promise, maybe, or the beginning of one. After that, the rhythm of their days changed. Elliot started leaving small gifts outside her door, wooden bookmarks carved with foxes and bears, tiny furniture pieces that looked like they belonged in a dollhouse but carried the weight of real craftsmanship. Claire responded in sketches, watercolor notes left on his porch, often folded inside envelopes with hand-drawn vines curling around his name. They learned each other in moments. She learned that he drank coffee when he was anxious and tea when he was calm. He learned that she hummed softly when she painted, a song without words. She started leaving her studio window open when it rained, knowing he might walk by. He started building again quietly, without announcing it. One evening, they found themselves at the town's fall fair. Neither of them had planned to go, but both ended up there, drawn by the scent of cinnamon and laughter in the air. They walked together under strings of golden lights, shared caramel apples, and sat side by side on the Ferris wheel. From the top, the town stretched like a painting. Below them, Claire leaned her head against Elliot's shoulder. Do you ever feel like something good is about to happen, but you're afraid to say it out loud? She asked. Elliot turned his head slightly, resting his cheek against her hair. Every time I see you. That night, when he walked her home, they stood under her porch light for a long time, neither wanting to go inside, neither brave enough to close the distance. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, he said. But I still want to try, she added, and that was enough. He didn't press for more. He just reached for her hand, held it, and that night, Claire fell asleep with her fingers still tingling and her heart wide open. It was a slow, gentle unfolding, the way Claire and Elliot slipped into each other's lives. There was no single moment when everything changed. Instead, it was dozens of quiet choices. 1,000 little yeses spoken not with words, but with time, with trust, and with presence. The kind of love that builds not on dramatic gestures, but on showing up consistently, quietly, and wholeheartedly. Elliot began walking Claire home every Tuesday and Saturday without being asked. Sometimes he brought her fresh bread from the morning market. Other times, just a look that told her she was never walking alone again. Claire, in return, started leaving her porch light on for him. just a small light glowing warm in the dark. Waiting like she was, they spent more time together, longer hours in the cafe, afternoons at the bookstore, evenings in Claire's studio. Her space, once reserved for solitude, slowly became a place of shared comfort. Elliot would sit cross-legged on the rug while Claire painted, occasionally offering opinions that surprised her in their insight. She loved the way he saw details, the curve of a line, the emotion in a color things no one else noticed. One afternoon, she brought out an old photo album. Not on purpose. She had been cleaning when Elliot dropped by with 2 coffees and a smile that made her forget about the weather. Entirely. He spotted the open book on the floor, knelt beside it, and asked, "Is that your family?" She hesitated, then sat beside him. The photos were faded and soft around the edges. Her parents, arms wrapped around each other in the back garden. Claire, as a little girl, paint on her cheeks, books at her feet. As they flipped through the pages, Claire told him stories she hadn't shared with anyone in years, how her father would whistle while making pancakes, how her mother always left notes in her lunchbox. When she reached the last page, Claire's hands stilled, her voice dropped. "I stopped looking at these after the accident. For a long time, it felt like remembering made it harder." Elliot didn't speak. He simply reached out and closed his hand gently over hers, grounding her. His presence filled the room, warm and safe, like a weighted blanket on a cold day. "I'm glad you're sharing them now," he said softly. Later, when he left, Claire found a note folded beneath her teacup. One sentence written in Elliot's neat, blocky handwriting. "Some memories aren't meant to be let go. They're meant to be carried by someone who understands." She pressed the note to her chest and let herself cry. Their bond grew in these quiet moments. On a windy Sunday afternoon, Elliot brought Claire to his workshop for the first time. It smelled of sawdust and cedar and something achingly familiar. She wandered through half-finished projects, touching carved headboards and drawers that didn't yet have handles. Elliot watched her with a kind of reverence. "I used to love building things," he confessed, voice low. "But after my mom died, it all felt empty." Claire turned to him, expression gentle. Maybe it just needed someone else to matter to. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the corner, pulled out a small wooden chest, and placed it in her hands. "I made this for her," he said, "but maybe it's time it held someone else's story." Claire ran her fingers over the smooth surface, then opened the lid to find the inside lined with soft velvet, empty but full of intention. "You made this," she whispered. "For you now," he said, "to keep what matters most." He didn't kiss her then either, but she leaned in, resting her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her for the first time slowly, securely, like she was the missing piece of something long unfinished. Their intimacy wasn't defined by physical touch, but by emotional closeness. They shared their fears in pieces, not all at once. Claire told him about the days when grief hit her like a sudden wave and she couldn't breathe. Elliot confessed that sometimes he still talked to his mother when the house felt too quiet. They built a world in which those things were safe to say. Elliot started building again. Not for clients, not for orders, but for her. He built her a reading nook, curved perfectly to fit her small window. He crafted wooden picture frames that now lined the walls of her studio, holding her drawings like cherished memories. And one afternoon, he brought over a table, just the right size for 2. "This is for when you don't want to eat alone," he said. Claire touched the polished wood, her voice trembling. "Thank you for knowing that without me saying it." He looked at her, eyes steady. "You don't have to say anything. I hear you anyway." On the nights they didn't see each other, they wrote letters, not texts, not emails. Real, handwritten letters. Claire would leave hers tucked into the mailbox, and Elliot would respond the next day with his. They shared everything through those note streams, childhood memories, thoughts too tender for the spoken word. Their letters became a world of their own. One late evening, as winter crept into Riverway and frost kissed the windows, they sat on Claire's porch wrapped in blankets, sipping spiced tea. Stars blinked quietly above them. Claire turned to him. You know, I always thought love would feel like lightning. But with you, it feels like coming home after being lost for too long. Elliot reached for her hand. That's how I know. It's real. And in that moment, the distance between them disappeared. He leaned in slowly, hesitantly, as if giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their first kiss was not fireworks. It was warmth, soft, reverent, a brush of lips that lingered, deepened, and said everything they hadn't yet put into words. It was the kind of kiss that didn't ask for more but promised everything. From that night on, their bond only deepened. They began dreaming out loud together, talking about trips they might take, books they might write, furniture pieces he could design with her illustrations etched into them. He showed her blueprints. She showed him character sketches. They began imagining a shared future, one filled with sunlit rooms and handwritten notes, storybooks and sawdust, love that was built like furniture, strong, quiet, and meant to last. It wasn't perfect. Claire still had days when she shut down, retreating into silence. Elliot sometimes wrestled with shadows of doubt, unsure if he could ever be enough. But they learned to hold space for each other, to sit in the hard moments without trying to fix them, to offer hands, not solutions. In the quiet, they found what neither of them had known they were missing. Love that didn't need to be loud to be true. Love that didn't need to be declared to be known. Love that existed in quiet rooms, in soft glances, in the space between heartbeats. And most of all, love that felt like home. The winter that followed was both the most beautiful and the most uncertain season of their lives. Snow fell gently across Riverway, dusting rooftops and blanketing Claire's studio in a hush that matched the stillness in her heart. The days were short but sweet. There were candlelit dinners at the little table Elliot built, evenings spent bundled together under a quilt, while Claire read stories aloud and Elliot carved ornaments from leftover cedar. Their quiet world felt untouchable, like a snow globe, sealed from the rest of the world. But even snow globes can be shaken. It started with a letter. An email, to be exact. From a well-known publishing house in New York, Claire had sent in a portfolio nearly a year ago on a whim, never expecting to hear back. But now they wanted her. Not just for a book, but a full-time position as lead illustrator for a children's series. A dream, one she had buried beneath loss, fear, and the quiet safety of Riverway. She didn't tell Elliot right away, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't trust herself. The offer came with a relocation, a full move, away from Riverway, away from the studio, the bookstore, the life she'd finally rebuilt. Away from Elliot. She read the offer a dozen times, heart aching. It was everything she had once wanted, everything her parents would have celebrated. But now, the thought of leaving the quiet rhythms she had built with Elliot, of leaving him, felt like trying to breathe underwater. When she finally told him, it was snowing again. She stood in the doorway of his workshop, holding the printed email like it was evidence of a crime. Elliot listened carefully, silently, as he always did. His face didn't change much. Just his eyes, the way they dimmed, like a fire pulling back into embers. That's amazing, he said, his voice calm. You've worked so hard for this. Claire nodded, but her hands trembled. It's not just a project, Elliot. It's a job, a contract. A move, I know. She waited, hoped, feared, wanted him to say, don't go. Wanted him to say, we'll figure it out. Wanted something other than that quiet nod. So, she asked, her voice breaking. What does that mean for us? Elliot looked at her, his expression unreadable. I don't want to be the reason you say no to something you've always wanted. The words struck her like cold water. I didn't say I wanted to go, she whispered, but you didn't say you didn't. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. That made it worse. They stood in silence, snow swirling between them like ash from a fire they hadn't meant to light. For the first time, their quiet wasn't comforting. It was heavy, hollow dot in the days that followed. Things shifted, not drastically, but in all the little ways that mattered. Claire stopped leaving notes in the mailbox. Elliot didn't come by on Tuesday. When they spoke, it was careful, polite, as if they were afraid of waking something fragile. Claire wrestled with herself. She knew the offer wouldn't wait forever, but every time she tried to imagine saying yes, something inside her twisted. She started sketching again, furiously, as if trying to draw an answer, but the lines blurred. The characters didn't look like themselves. Everything felt off. Elliot, too, pulled back. He returned to his workshop, but found himself staring at unfinished wood, unable to move forward. He wanted to tell her not to go. He wanted to say that she had become the reason he built again, the reason he got out of bed on the days when grief still pressed down like a storm cloud. But he didn't, because love to him had always meant sacrifice. And he didn't know how to ask someone to stay when they had every right to leave. One evening, after a long walk through the snow-dusted town, Claire arrived at her studio to find a small wooden box on her doorstep. Inside was a hand-carved fox and bear dancing under a tree. Beneath them, etched in delicate cursive, were the words, "Some stories are worth fighting for." Her heart ached. Her hands trembled. She rushed to Elliot's workshop, her breath visible in the cold, but found it empty. Only sawdust and silence. When she returned home, the email still sat open on her desk, mocking her with the promise of everything she'd ever dreamed of except him. That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did Elliot. He sat on the porch of his mother's old house, staring at the stars, wondering how something so right had become so fragile. The next morning, Claire made her choice. She walked into the bookstore, found Miriam behind the counter, and asked for a stack of blank paper and the quietest corner. Then she began to write, not to the publishing house, but to Elliot. She wrote about how he had changed her, not loudly, but completely. How he had loved her in ways that healed her without ever asking her to explain. How the silence between them had never felt empty, only sacred. She wrote about how scared she was to walk away from her dreams, and how even more terrified she was to walk away from him. When she was done, she folded the letter and walked through the town with trembling hands. She left it in his mailbox and walked away before she could second-guess herself. That night, she didn't hear from him. The next morning, there was no letter in return. By the third day, she felt something inside her begin to crumble. Had she waited too long? Had she already lost him? On the fourth day, Riverway awoke to a soft fog curling over the rooftops, the kind that made the town look like a painting half finished, waiting for the light to return. Claire stood at her window, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the empty street below. She hadn't slept. The letter she'd left for Elliot still had no reply. The silence between them, once so comforting, now felt unbearable, like a door quietly closed. She sat down at her art table, pulled her sketchbook into her lap, and opened to a blank page. Her hand hovered over it, pencil ready, but nothing. Kim, the fox, the bear, the stories. They had all quieted as if waiting to. She leaned forward, rested her head on her arms, and for the first time in a long while, let herself cry, not from grief, but from fear. Fear that she had been too late, that love had come softly, steadily, only to slip away before it could be spoken out loud. Miles away, Though still within the same town, Elliot sat on his mother's porch, holding her letter. He had read it a dozen times, every word echoing louder than any confession ever could. His hands trembled when he held it, not because he didn't feel the same, but because he had spent his whole life believing he was not something people stayed for. He had grown used to being the afterthought, the helper, the quiet one in the corner. And now someone had written to him with fire in her heart and tears in her ink, saying she didn't want to chase her dreams if it meant losing him. He should have run to her the second he finished reading. But fear, the oldest, cruelest kind, had held him back until now, because even fear, when faced with the truth of love, loses its power. He stood up, pulled on his coat, and walked out. Claire was still staring at the page when she heard the knock. Soft, once, then again. Her heart leapt before she even turned around. She opened the door. There he was. Elliot stood in the morning fog, cheeks pink from the cold, snowflakes clinging to the edges of his coat. He held nothing in his hands. No carved figure. Just himself. "I got your letter," he said. Claire's breath caught. "I should have come sooner," he added. I've never been the one someone chooses." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to choose between you and my dreams." Elliot stepped closer. "You don't have to." Tears welled in her eyes. "But the job, Claire." He interrupted gently. "I love the way you light up when you talk about your stories. I love how you bring things to life with color. That offer, it's not something you should turn down for me. But it's also not something you should take alone." She blinked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, his voice cracking, "I'll go with you. If that's where your heart is, then that's where I want to be." Claire stared at him, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't need Riverway to be home," Elliot continued. "Home's wherever I hear your voice in the morning. Wherever you're sketching in the corner and I'm pretending not to watch." She took a shaky step forward. "You'd leave everything?" He smiled softly. "I'd be building new things. With you, that's everything to me." Her hands reached for his thin fingers, threading through his like puzzle pieces, returning to their place. They stood there in the doorway, nothing else between them but breath and warmth and truth. "You loved me in the quietest ways," she whispered, but I heard every word. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "And I'll keep loving you, whether in a quiet town or a city that never sleeps." Their kiss this time wasn't hesitant. It was certain, steady. A full circle drawn without a break. It held every word they hadn't said, every fear they had survived, and every promise they now carried forward. A kiss that felt like stepping into light after years of wandering through mist. Later, they sat side by side on Claire's porch steps, her head resting on his shoulder, fingers still laced together. The fog began to lift, revealing the town, slowly waking around them. For the first time in days, Claire's sketchbook sat open, a new drawing forming under her hand, a fox and a bear boarding a train, bags in paw. Stars overhead. They didn't need to speak. They had said everything. The snow had melted by. The time they left Riverway, it didn't happen overnight. There were goodbyes to be said, boxes to be packed, tears shed beneath familiar doorways. Miriam cried when Claire handed over her keys to the studio, but kissed her forehead and whispered, "You're not leaving. Your stories will always bring you back." Elliot took apart his mother's old workbench, salvaging the pieces that mattered most, tucking them into the back of the truck like memories you carry forward. Their last night in town was quiet. Just the two of them, curled up on a blanket under the stars, watching the fireflies blink in the long grass. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. There was a peace in that silence, a stillness that wrapped around them like a promise. New. York was noisy, bright, fast. Everything Riverway was not. But somehow, Claire and Elliot made it theirs. They found an apartment on the top floor of a quiet brownstone with creaky stairs and a tiny balcony that overlooked a sea of rooftop gardens. The city pulsed around them, but inside their walls, life moved at the pace of love. Claire took the job. Her first week was terrifying and exhilarating. She worked in a sunlit office filled with paper and color and people who believed in her. She missed Riverway, yes, but when she came home each night and found Elliot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, sawdust in his hair from setting up his new workshop in the corner of their living room, she remembered why she came. Elliot, too, found his rhythm. He started small, crafting wooden desk pieces and custom furniture for neighbors who couldn't believe such detailed work came out of a fourth-floor apartment. Word spread. Orders grew. One day, Claire walked in to find him sketching something. Knew an entire line of children's room furniture, each piece inspired by her characters. A rocking chair shaped like a fox. A reading bench with a bear carved on the backrest. A partnership of hearts turned into a partnership of purpose. They still wrote each other letters. Even though they lived under the same roof, they continued their tradition. Notes tucked into coat pockets. Tiny folded pages slipped into mugs. Handwritten words that said, "I believe in you." And you make the hard days soft. On rainy mornings, Claire would sit by the window with her tea, and Elliot would place a new carving beside her sketchbook, always something small, always. Something that meant "I see you." On their 1-year anniversary of leaving Riverway, Claire surprised him with a book. Not one she illustrated for work, but one she made just for him. A picture book about a quiet carpenter and a gentle artist who found each other not with shouts, but with whispers. Each page was a memory: the cafe, the rain, the fox, and the bear. On the last page, there was a drawing of their little apartment, golden light in the windows, and 2 hands reaching for each other. The caption read, "He loved her in the quietest ways, and she never stopped listening." Elliot didn't say anything. He just pulled her into his arms, held her close, and when he kissed her, it tasted like every soft morning they had yet to wake up to. Years later, they visited Riverway. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The ivy still curled around the bookstore windows. The cafe still served chai the way she liked it. But now, when Claire walked those streets, Elliot walked beside her, his hand in hers. They were no longer 2 people searching. They had found what they were looking for in each other. They stood in front of her old studio and looked up at the window, golden light spilling through. "It feels smaller," she whispered. "That's because your world got bigger," he said. Sat on the bench outside Maple and Pine, sharing a muffin like they used to, watching the town drift by. There were children playing in the street, laughter echoing between buildings. Peace. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder and smiled. "You were right. About what?" "Home isn't a place." He looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "It's a person." And that person, for each of them, would always be the other dot in a world that often screamed. They had found a love that whispered and never once needed to raise its voice to be heard.